Hey everyone, this is my presentation, Invitation into Intimacy. The biblical narrative and the divine human relationship. What we're going to look at through the course of the canon is this really intimate picture of God and how he relates to his people. And we're going to look at the redemptive narrative through an increasing canonical clarity that he wants nothing short of something like a marriage between his people and himself. And so follow me along as we go throughout the biblical narrative, looking for the development of this theme. To begin, I just want to read this scripture over us as we think through the amazing love of God. For love is strong as death, jealousy is fierce as the grave. Its flashes are flashes of fire, the very flame of the Lord. So the Bible begins with a lot of different metaphors in understanding our relationship with God. We're priests in a temple. We're royal representatives under a king, a suzerain vassal kind of relationship. We have God as our father and we as his children. But there is this interesting thing that the Bible does begin and end, these bookends, with a bit of a wedding. There's a wedding of sorts in Genesis chapter 2, and there's a wedding of sorts in Revelation 21. But over the course of the canon, we kind of get the sense that the real romance is between God and his people. So how does this develop? Well, we're going to watch the increasing canonical clarity develop as each genre and part of the biblical narrative add a different nuance to this picture, and we're going to sit with these as they continue to flesh out this relationship. And you'll see how each different genre in the scriptures kind of hones in on a particular development as things come into focus, that this is a romance between God and his people. So as we watch some prefigurations that become more and more clear and become this promise of consummation, let's trace through, shall we? So here's a little bit of preview. We've got the Pentateuch and this idea of kana and exclusivity. This word in Hebrew, you can translate it as jealousy, has to do with a husband's rights to the exclusive relationship with his wife. And we're going to see how the Pentateuch uses this language to talk about God and his people. The histories, they recount the story of Yahweh and Israel as this relational narrative, that the relational fidelity that Israel has to God is really the primary interpretive lens of the history of Israel. We're going to look at the prophets, and as they become more explicit, as they spell out, as they paint, as they use their poetry and their imaginations and their visions to paint this picture of God as a bride, as a wife, as God portrays his relationship with his people, the heartbreak of an unfaithful wife. In the wisdom literature, we have this intimacy and even a romance of sort. This idea that what God is doing with his people is like someone wooing a romantic partner. And so this premarital romantic narrative that we have, say in Song of Songs, actually kind of typifies God's relationship with us. And in the Gospels, we have this messianic bridegroom motif that gets added through a few parables and other places. And in the epistles, we have this eschatological wedding that we've been looking for. And so we're going to watch this increasing clarity go throughout the canon. So let's dive in. Pentateuch. So this idea of Kanag really gets developed in Numbers 5. There's this case law about a wife who is suspected of being unfaithful to her husband, and it's really based on this concept of Kana, which is, it's more than jealousy. It has more to do with rights and honor, but it is a language that the Exodus and the rest of the Pentateuch picks up to describe covenant unfaithfulness, specifically idolatry. So so there's this betrayal and renewal cycle that we see, and that idolatry is described as an act of adultery. So the implicit message here, based on the linguistic field, is that God is in relationship with his people akin to a husband and wife. And so God's jealousy is actually affronted here. And we know that one of the key things about this particular metaphor is this reciprocity. And we see God develop this sense that he wants a responsive relationship with his people. He wants all of their heart, all of their mind, all of their soul, all of their strength, right? And so there's this motif, implicit in this motif is that God's relational expectations are that of a husband and a bride. The histories, they build on this predisposition, and as we know, the Deuteronomistic history, right? This lens interpreted through the fidelity that Israel has to God. We see these cycles, say in Judges, for example, of this broken covenant and God getting their attention and renewing and then forgetting. And so there's this kind of cycle all throughout the histories of Israel's kind of overwhelmed appreciation and renewal of their faithfulness to Yahweh, and then they forget and they fall away and they're unfaithful. And so we have things like Solomon, who kind of typify this theocratic kind of violation where the king is not supposed to take many wives, and in fact Solomon takes many, and there's a theological implication to this. And so we get this non-exclusivity of marriage, paint and color the non-exclusivity of Israel with Yahweh, and so indeed they chase after other gods. We see the pervasive presence of high places, and that being framed as this prostitution-like event, not only from a cultural background, but also figuratively, as we'll see in the prophets. So the rest of the histories, this whole idea of God coming to dwell with his people, as we saw in that prefigured relationship, the hints of Genesis chapter 2, where the son leaves the household of his father to dwell with his bride. We have this frame of reference at the temple and the tabernacle. These things represent this place that God is actually dwelling with his people. There's something of the marital concept here, and so we see that the covenant betrayed through this relational narrative. This infidelity actually kind of spoils the marriage bed, you could say, and it leads to what we see in the end of the histories. 2 Kings, we've got this betrayal leading to divine abandonment, and as we'll see, the prophets wrestle with this and what is God up to, and how does God process this. But as we see the renewal happen in Ezra and Nehemiah, just as if in Solomon, the idea of being married, broadly speaking, is a theological kind of, it's related to the theology of the people. We see the people, rightfully or not, they end up divorcing their foreign wives in a plea to get God's renewal attention. God, we want to be exclusive in everything that we do, and we're going to commit ourselves only to you and to your people. And so there's this attempt at renewal that is carried out through the metaphor of marriage in an embodied way. As we'll see, the prophets are invited into the same thing. Let's move forward. Prophets. So Hosea, not a better example in the scriptures of how this gets embodied. But Hosea, as a sign act, his life is invited to represent the relationship that God is having with his people. And here we are. He takes a wife who is unfaithful. Some really rich metaphorical additions that get developed here as a result of the prophets. Hosea recalls the Exodus as if it was like a honeymoon. Jeremiah, he has this whole historical bent of what has happened with God and his people as this romance, of this give and take, of this winning over, and then this unfaithfulness of the bride that is Israel. And even in Jeremiah, it gets real explicit with the metaphor. It talks about the northern kingdom receiving a writ of divorce. And so we see this metaphor taking on new nuances, that the covenant history of God's people is largely seen as a marriage covenant. And so Ezekiel chapter 16, there's nobody as vivid as crazy Uncle Zeke. Everybody's got a crazy uncle, and biblical prophecy is no different. Ezekiel chapter 16, the story of adoption and marriage, and then this betrayal. And it gets so incredibly vivid. It's a text that's hard to read in church. So we've got this Ezekiel 16 section, and we have Ezekiel just adding so much detail that we don't even need to know. But he's rubbing Israel's memory and their spiritual sensitivities in this. There's jarring language that what has happened in the relationship between God and His people is like a wife leaving not only to prostitute herself, but also to actually to pay her lovers just to sleep with her. Like, it gets really, really crazy. And so the idea here is that this heart-wrenching narrative that just makes us feel uneasy, this is a glimpse at God's heart for His people and how He feels about their idolatry, about all of the ways that they're unfaithful to Him. And so this metaphor continues to grow in our understanding. It's a very emotive, a very mutual metaphor. Yahweh could do better is really kind of where we're at with this, isn't it? But that's not where He leaves it. And we see some really key developments come as a result of the prophets. It's worth tarrying over for a moment. Let me read a couple of scriptures. Hosea chapter 2, verse 23. I will plant her for myself in the land. I will show my love to the one I called not my loved one. I will say to those called not my people, you are my people. And they will say, you are my God. And there's this renaming in the light of a restored relationship. Some of the themes that we see in Genesis chapter 2, Adam names his wife Ish to Isha. And here we have these echoes of there's something of the romance of this commitment of God that is playing out much like a marriage covenant. Jeremiah chapter 31, 3-4. We have the Lord appeared to us from afar, saying, I have loved you with an everlasting love. I have drawn you with unfailing kindness. I will build you up again, and you, virgin Israel, will be rebuilt. Again, you will take up your timbrels and go out to dance with the joyful. And so this fruitful relationship that God is wanting for humanity, that is modeled through Adam and Eve, there's this fruitfulness that's coming as a result of God's redemptive wooing and rewooing. And remarkably, as we see here, atonement starts to carry some nuances of sexual renewal, that virginity could be restored. This is our category. God speaking over a very beleaguered Israel of their infidelity, that His work is going to actually restore their purity. It's an incredible way of speaking about atonement. Ezekiel chapter 48, verse 35, second part of the verse, and the name of the city from that time on will be the Lord is there. Just like Adam is leaving his father's house to be with his bride, there's this answer to the divine abandonment that we've read about, that God is indeed, Ezekiel devotes the back half of his prophecy to this amazing cohabitation. God is going to dwell again with His people richly. Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 62-63, after this graphic betrayal scene that we just talked about, so I will establish my covenant with you, and you will know that I am the Lord. Then when I make atonement for you and all you have done, you will remember and be ashamed, and never again open your mouth because of your humiliation, declares the sovereign Lord. And so while the biblical narrative in Genesis chapter 2 ends with the they were naked and they were unashamed, God is going to use shame in a redemptive way. And we see through Ezekiel's narrative that there's this loss of shame, that they're just brazen. And the return of shame actually leads to an honoring of Israel. Again, this recovery of their dignity, of their purity, of their virginity, and presented as an honorable and beautiful bride. So watch for that as we continue to move through. let's move into wisdom literature. The one that stands out is Song of Songs. There's this rabbinic tradition called Darash, and let me just quote here. According to the Darash, the song expresses covenant love for God and aims at national redemption. And again, the song expresses figuratively the love relationship between God and Israel. And so we get this very human account of what's happening with Solomon and one of his brides, and the way that this has been interpreted early on, this metaphorical relationship between God and his people. And it's very beautiful and romantic and poetic, and it celebrates pleasure in a way that I think we can say that God wants the deepest expressions of human reciprocity and mutualism that you find in the metaphor of marriage and the metaphor of relationship and the metaphor of even sexuality, that God desires an intimacy that is beyond the intimacy that can be described with his people. And so this poetic wisdom literature adds just a rich picture of the way God wants to enjoy his people. All right, let's move into the New Testament, the gospel. Jesus adds a lot of this whole bridegroom imagery, and there's this development of the messianic bridegroom that happens, and Jesus adds this in parable form. Jesus talks about this as a parable, and he casts himself as the bridegroom. We have John the Baptist actually suggesting Jesus is this bridegroom. He's coming for the bride. We have this scene where Jesus is being questioned about not fasting, and he self-identifies as the bridegroom. Like, why wouldn't we feast when I'm here? And there's this clarity that's coming into focus where this wedding hope, this re-wedding hope, that's this God is coming to romantically win over his people and recommit to them, or to have them rather recommit to him, that this is unfolding in the ministry and the life and the person of Jesus. And in the epistles, as a key development here, this eschatological wedding starts to become very vivid, and some of the categories that we've picked up already before are fleshed out even fuller. This church Jerusalem concept as the eschatological bride, like we said, the scriptures close with this wedding narrative. Revelation 21, 1-3, that you've got this the city is being adorned like a bride for the bridegroom, and we have a theological hope, an eschatological hope is born out in the concept, in the imagery of a wedding. You got Paul's use of marriage in the Jesus and church relationship. You've got 2 Corinthians 11, where he's concerned with protecting the virginity of the church. Again, this atonement and sanctification metaphor being cast in a marriage metaphor, that they're re-eligible as pure, made pure, to be married, to be wed to God, to be given to him as a pure bride. In Ephesians chapter 5, you have this placing of the romantic, self-sacrificial love of God is akin to something that's happening within the marriage relationship. It's instructive for marriage, but it's also instructive for how we view the biblical narrative and God's aims with us. And so if we take a step back from all of this, we can think of the creation, fall, redemption, consummation, narrative structure of the biblical narrative, and we can look at it this way. There is original union. There is repeated infidelity. There is restored virginity, and there is an eschatological wedding. And so through this, we see that all throughout the scriptures, there is this growing canonical clarity that God indeed wants to invite his people into the most intimate of relationships, and that he will fully restore them in order to do so. All right, I hope this has been instructive and helpful and inspiring, and I can't wait to hear what other themes we're exploring together as a class. All right, Godspeed.